You're about to make the wrong call, sir. The voice came low and steady, almost lost beneath the rising whine of alarms and the restless churn of rotor blades in the distance. But it carried, cutting through the chaos like something heavier than sound, and for a fraction of a second, Colonel Richard Hayes paused mid-step on the sun-scorched tarmac of Fort Calder, the heat shimmering in waves off the concrete. His officers frozen around him as a crippled Black Hawk sat 50 yards away, silent, grounded, and defiant against every diagnostic reading that insisted it should be airborne. Lieutenant Aaron Blake snapped his head toward the source, irritation flashing across his face as he spotted the old man standing just outside the perimeter line, hands buried in a faded field jacket, posture relaxed, almost indifferent, like he had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to be there. "This is a restricted area," Blake said sharply, his voice edged with authority that hadn't quite settled into experience. "Whatever you think you know, now's not the time." The technicians nearby barely looked up, too busy scrolling through greenlit screens that confirmed everything was operational, while the helicopter remained stubbornly still, a contradiction no one could explain. But the old man didn't move, didn't argue, his pale eyes drifting from the spinning wind indicators to a small, nearly invisible seam along the engine cowling, a detail so minor it didn't exist to anyone else on that flight line. "Sir," he said again, quieter this time, not to Blake, but to the colonel, "that system's lying to you." The words hung there, simple, unforced, and for a moment no one responded. Then Blake let out a short, dismissive breath, stepping forward with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We've got 12 certified techs, 3 specialists, and a live uplink to engineering," he said, gesturing toward the open laptops and cables snaking across the ground. "I think we're covered." A few of the younger crew members smirked, the kind of quick, easy confidence that came from trusting the readouts more than the silence of a machine that refused to obey them. The old man nodded once, almost politely, as if the response had been expected, and went back to watching, not the screens, not the people, but the aircraft itself, the way the sunlight hit the metal, the way the faintest tremor ran along the rotor mast with each gust of wind, subtle things, quiet things, things that didn't register on any display. Colonel Hayes exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as the seconds slipped by and the schedule collapsed around him. Dignitaries waiting, timelines narrowing, pressure building in ways that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with consequence. He turned slightly, just enough to look at the old man again. Really look this time, taking in the worn jacket, the stillness, the complete absence of urgency, and something about it didn't fit, didn't match the noise, didn't match the panic, didn't match the certainty everyone else was clinging to. "What's your name?" Hayes asked, the question quiet but deliberate, and for the first time, the old man met his gaze fully. "Ethan Cole," he said, and nothing more, no explanation, no credentials, just a name that seemed to settle into the space between them like it belonged there. Blake scoffed under his breath, already turning back to his team, but Hayes didn't move, not yet, because something in the way the man had said it, something in the calm that hadn't cracked once under pressure, felt less like an opinion, and more like a warning. And out on the silent helicopter, untouched by all their effort, the heat shimmered harder, as if waiting for someone to finally see what it had been showing all along. The air did not move for a second after he said his name, as if even the heat had to settle around it. And Colonel Hayes held his gaze a moment longer before shifting his attention back to the helicopter. But now something had changed, not in the machine, not in the noise, but in the way he was listening. Lieutenant Blake stepped closer, lowering his voice but not his attitude. "Sir, we are burning time. We have a full diagnostics pass and everything is green. This is not the place for guesswork." Hayes did not answer immediately, his eyes tracing the same lines Ethan had been watching, the slight misalignment of the panel that looked perfect unless you knew where not to look, the faint vibration that did not match the rhythm of the wind, small things, quiet things, things that did not belong in reports. "Run it again," Hayes said finally, his tone calm but firm. Blake blinked, surprised. "Sir, we already did, twice." "Then run it again," Hayes repeated, and this time there was no room to argue. The technicians scrambled, fingers moving faster across keyboards, screens refreshing with the same clean data. The same perfect lie. Ethan did not move. He did not need to. His attention fixed on that one point. The seam just below the exhaust where the metal caught the sunlight differently for half a second before settling back into uniformity. It was not visible unless you waited for it. Unless you knew patience was part of the process. A young specialist nearby, Daniel Cruz, had been watching the exchange from the edge of the group, his brow furrowed. Something about the old man's stillness pulled at him. Not confidence, not authority, but certainty, the kind that did not need to be explained. Cruz shifted his weight, glancing between the colonel and the silent figure by the line, and for the first time since the alarm started, he felt like they might be looking at the wrong place. "Sir," Blake said again, more controlled now but tighter. "The system is not showing any fault." Hayes nodded slowly, but his focus did not leave the aircraft. "That is exactly what concerns me," he replied, and Blake fell quiet, not convinced, but no longer dismissive, because the tone had changed, and everyone felt it. The helicopter sat there, unchanged, the heat rising off its surface in slow, wavering waves. And then Ethan took a step forward, not past the line, not breaking any rule, just enough to shift the angle of his view. His hand came out of his pocket, fingers flexing once as if remembering something older than the moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as the light hit the panel again. There it was, not movement, not failure, but a subtle inconsistency, a fraction of a second where the alignment did not hold. A memory stirred behind his eyes, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet echo of a different machine, a different day, where everything had also looked fine until it was not, and the difference had lived in a place no system could measure. Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice almost a whisper when it came. "You never opened it," he said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what was already true. Blake turned sharply. "There was no reason to," he replied. But even as he said it, the certainty in his voice was thinner, and Colonel Hayes heard that, heard the shift, felt the weight of the decision pressing closer, not between right and wrong, but between trusting data and trusting something else entirely, something quieter, something older, and for the first time since the alarms began, the noise around them seemed less important than the silence standing just beyond the line. Lieutenant Blake hesitated for the first time. The kind of hesitation that did not come from doubt alone, but from the slow realization that something had already slipped out of his control, and Colonel Hayes saw it, saw the shift in posture, the tightening of the jaw, the way the younger officer's certainty was beginning to fracture under pressure that no manual had prepared him for. The technicians kept working, but their movements had changed, faster but less confident, like they were trying to outrun a problem instead of understanding it. And through all of it, Ethan Cole remained still, his eyes fixed on that same narrow seam as if the entire aircraft had reduced itself to that single imperfect line. "Open it," Hayes said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a weight that settled over the team instantly. Blake turned, surprised. "Sir, that will break protocol. We will need clearance and paperwork for." "Open it," Hayes repeated, and this time there was no resistance left in the order, only direction, the kind that did not invite discussion, and the technicians froze for half a second before one of them stepped forward, hands already reaching for the tools they had not considered using before. Specialist Cruz felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not exactly, but anticipation, like he was watching a moment unfold that he would not fully understand until much later. The panel bolts came loose one by one, each turn of the wrench cutting through the hum of the tarmac, small, deliberate sounds that seemed louder than they should have been, and as the panel shifted, just slightly at first, the light caught it differently, the illusion of perfection breaking in a way so subtle, it almost felt like it had always been there waiting to be noticed. Blake stepped closer, his earlier confidence replaced by a sharper focus, his eyes scanning the opening as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what the system had told him. "That is not possible," he murmured, but no one answered him, because Ethan had already moved, not quickly, not urgently, but with a kind of precision that made space around him without anyone saying a word. He stopped just short of the aircraft, respecting the invisible boundary that had defined his place until now, and leaned slightly, just enough to see inside the narrow gap. His hand lifting, hovering for a moment before pointing to a small component tucked behind the panel. something most would have dismissed as insignificant. "There," he said quietly, and Cruz leaned in, squinting, trying to see what the old man saw. And at first there was nothing obvious, just clean lines and intact connections. But then he noticed it, a fraction of a misalignment. A connection that sat a hair off from where it should have been. Too small to trigger a fault, too precise to be random. Blake followed his gaze, his breath catching slightly as the realization settled in, not all at once, but in layers, peeling back the confidence he had placed in the system. The sensor would not catch that, Cruz said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. And Ethan gave the smallest nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like the conclusion had already been reached long before this moment. Colonel Hayes watched it all without interrupting, his eyes moving from the exposed panel to Ethan and back again. And in that quiet exchange, he understood something that could not be written into reports or taught in training. That experience was not measured in years or rank, but in the ability to see what others had learned to ignore. The air shifted again, not physically, but in the way every person on that tarmac now looked at the old man standing just beyond the line, no longer as an outsider, but as the center of something they had not recognized until it was already too late to pretend otherwise. And as the wind picked up slightly, brushing across the aircraft and the men around it, the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise that had come before it. No one spoke for several seconds after the flaw was seen, not because they did not understand it, but because they did, and that made the silence heavier than before. Lieutenant Blake straightened slowly, his eyes still locked on the tiny misalignment, as if looking long enough might change what it meant, but it did not. The truth sat there, small and undeniable, and it had not come from his systems. It had come from the man he had dismissed minutes earlier. "How did you even catch that?" Blake asked, the edge gone from his voice now, replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect but not ready to admit it yet. Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze still on the exposed panel, the sunlight shifting slightly as a cloud passed overhead, changing the reflection just enough to dull the illusion that had hidden the flaw in plain sight. "You listen," Ethan said finally, his voice low and even. "Not to what it tells you, but to what it does not." The words hung in the air. Simple, but they settled deeper than any technical explanation could have. Specialist Cruz felt it, the difference between knowledge and understanding, between reading data and seeing truth. And for a moment he forgot about rank, forgot about procedure, because what stood in front of him was something older, something built from years that no system could replicate. Colonel Hayes took a slow step forward, closing the distance that had separated him from Ethan since the beginning, not crossing any line, but shifting the balance of the space itself. His eyes moved from the panel to Ethan's face, studying him not as an outsider anymore, but as a man whose presence carried weight without needing to prove it. "Can it be fixed here?" Hayes asked, direct, without hesitation, and that question changed everything, because it was no longer about verifying, no longer about doubting. It was about trust. Blake looked at the colonel, then back at Ethan, and in that brief exchange he understood what had just happened. The decision had already been made, not loudly, not publicly, but in the quiet space where authority chose where to rest. Ethan glanced once more at the exposed component, his mind already moving through possibilities, not rushing, not forcing, just following a path that had been walked before under different skies, in different conditions, where mistakes had carried heavier consequences than delayed schedules. "It can," he said, just 2 words, but they landed with certainty, not optimism, not hope, certainty. Cruz stepped forward instinctively. "What do you need?" he asked, the question coming faster than protocol would allow, but no one stopped him. Not this time. Ethan's hand lifted slightly, pointing not at the obvious tools laid out on the tables, but at something off to the side, an older kit, half forgotten, its leather worn smooth from years of use. "That wrench," he said, and Cruz moved without thinking, grabbing it and bringing it over. The metal cooled despite the heat. Blake watched the exchange, the ease of it, the way direction flowed without resistance, and he felt something shift inside himself. Not loss, not exactly, but a quiet recalibration of what authority looked like. Colonel Hayes did not speak again. He did not need to. His presence alone now signaled the change. The trust had already been given, and everyone on that tarmac felt it. The moment when command passed not through rank, but through recognition, and as Ethan reached toward the open panel, steady and precise, the noise of the bass seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of wind brushing against metal and the quiet weight of a decision that could not be undone. The wrench felt heavier than it should have in Ethan's hand, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried with it. Years of use, years of memory, the kind of tool that did not belong to any system, but somehow understood every machine it touched. And as he stepped closer to the exposed panel, no one stopped him, not Lieutenant Blake, not the technicians, not even the rules that had held that line so firmly just minutes before. Colonel Hayes watched in silence, his arms at his sides, his posture steady, but his focus absolute. Every movement Ethan made now mattered, not just for the aircraft, but for the decision he had already made. Ethan did not rush. He never did, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the panel before guiding the wrench into position, the metal clicking softly as it settled, a small sound, almost lost in the open air, but to him it was clear, precise, like a note in a familiar rhythm. Specialist Cruz leaned in slightly, not too close, just enough to see, his breath held without realizing it, watching the way Ethan adjusted the angle, not forcing the component back into place, but easing it, aligning it with a patience that felt deliberate. Practiced, like this moment had already happened somewhere else long before today. And for a brief second, the heat of Fort Calder faded in Ethan's mind, replaced by something older, a different machine, a different sky, where the margin for error had been thinner and the cost of missing something like this had been far greater. He remembered the sound first, not alarms, not shouting, but the absence of expected noise. The way a machine goes quiet in the wrong way, and how that silence had taught him more than any manual ever could. The memory passed quickly, not overwhelming, just enough to guide his hands, to remind them of what they already knew. Back on the tarmac, the present settled in again, and the component shifted, just slightly, almost imperceptible, but enough to bring it back into alignment. Ethan paused, not immediately pulling away, his eyes scanning the connection once more, confirming not with a system, but with instinct, with experience, with that quiet sense that told him when something was right. Lieutenant Blake watched closely now, no longer skeptical, no longer dismissive, his expression tight with concentration as he tried to follow every movement, every decision, learning without being told, understanding without being taught. Colonel Hayes took a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction, not because the problem was solved yet, but because the right hands were on it now, and that mattered more than anything the system could report. Ethan finally withdrew the wrench, handing it back to Cruz without looking, his attention still on the panel. "Close it," he said, simple, direct, and Cruz moved immediately, securing the panel back into place with a care that mirrored what he had just witnessed. The bolts tightened, the seam returning to its original line. But this time it held, not perfect, but true, the difference invisible to most, but undeniable to those who knew where to look. A technician called out from behind the screens, "Systems are resetting." His voice uncertain at first, then sharper, more focused. "We are getting a different red now." Blake turned quickly, stepping toward the monitors, his eyes scanning the data as it updated, numbers shifting, indicators changing, and for the first time since the alarms began, the information matched the reality in front of them. He looked back at the helicopter, then at Ethan, the realization settling in fully now, not as a surprise, but as a fact he could no longer ignore. And in that quiet moment, as the wind moved across the tarmac and the aircraft sat ready once more, the balance of authority had already changed, not announced, not declared, but understood by everyone who had seen what just happened. The shift in the data did not come with celebration. It came quietly, almost cautiously, as if even the system needed a moment to accept what had just happened. The screens that had once shown perfect stability now reflected subtle corrections, small deviations aligning into something real, something honest. Lieutenant Blake stared at the monitor longer than necessary, his eyes moving across each line as if searching for an error, a glitch, something that would return the control back to him. But there was nothing to find. The numbers held steady, consistent, undeniable, and behind him the helicopter remained still, but no longer silent in the wrong way. There was a presence to it now, a readiness that had been missing before. Specialist Cruz let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his shoulders lowering slightly as the tension that had filled the tarmac began to loosen, not disappear, but change, the kind of tension that comes after something important has already been decided. Colonel Hayes stepped forward again, this time closing the distance fully, stopping beside Ethan rather than across from him, a subtle movement, but one that everyone noticed, because it was not about position, it was about alignment, about where authority chose to stand. Run the startup sequence, Hayes said, his voice calm, controlled, and for the first time since the alarms began, there was no urgency in it. Only expectation. The technicians moved quickly, but now their movements were focused, coordinated. The earlier frustration replaced by a quiet efficiency, switches were checked, systems cycled, and the helicopter responded, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like something waking up exactly the way it was meant to. Blake turned from the monitor, his expression no longer defensive, no longer sharp, but thoughtful, measured. He looked at Ethan, not as a problem to manage, but as something he had misjudged, something he had not recognized in time. You saw that from the reflection, Blake said, not asking, but confirming, trying to understand the process behind what had just unfolded. Ethan did not look at him, his gaze still on the aircraft, watching, listening, the same way he had from the beginning. I saw what did not match, he replied, his voice quiet, steady, and that was all. No explanation, no breakdown, just a truth that did not need to be expanded. Blake nodded slowly, absorbing it, not fully understanding yet, but no longer resisting it either. Colonel Hayes kept his eyes forward, the faintest hint of a nod acknowledging Ethan's presence beside him, not as an outsider, not as an exception, but as someone who belonged in that moment more than anyone else there. The rotor blades shifted slightly as the startup sequence progressed, a low hum building beneath the surface. Controlled, stable, exactly as it should have been from the start. The sound carried across the tarmac, blending with the wind and the distant noise of the base. But now it felt different, not chaotic, not uncertain, but grounded, deliberate. And as the machine came back to life, the realization settled fully across the team, not in words, not in recognition ceremonies, but in the quiet way they all adjusted their posture, their focus, their understanding of what had just happened, because the problem had never been the system. It had been the belief that the system could see everything. And standing there beside the helicopter, hands once again resting calmly at his sides, Ethan Cole did not claim the moment, did not draw attention to it, because for him, it was never about being right. It was about knowing when something was wrong, and acting before anyone else even realized it. The rotor began to turn with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each blade cutting through the hot air with a steady confidence that had been missing before, and no one spoke as the sound built. Not because there was nothing to say, but because anything spoken would have felt smaller than the moment itself. Lieutenant Blake stood just behind Colonel Hayes now, no longer issuing commands, no longer correcting others, his attention fixed entirely on the aircraft, as if it might reveal something else he had overlooked, something deeper than the flaw they had just corrected. Specialist Cruz remained near the panel, his hand still resting lightly against the metal as if confirming it was real, that the change had actually happened, that the machine was no longer resisting them. And through it all, Ethan Cole stepped back, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but quietly, almost instinctively, returning to the edge of the space he had occupied from the beginning, his role complete in a way that did not require acknowledgement. Colonel Hayes noticed it immediately, the way Ethan moved, out of the center without hesitation, without expectation, and that told him more than anything else had, because it confirmed what kind of man he was dealing with. Not one who stepped forward to be seen, but one who stepped in only when needed and stepped away just as easily. Hold it steady, Hayes said calmly, his voice cutting through the growing hum, and the crew responded without hesitation, their actions now aligned, synchronized in a way that had not been possible before. The helicopter lifted its energy, not leaving the ground yet, but ready, responsive, alive in the way it was meant to be. Blake glanced toward Ethan again, something unresolved still in his expression, not doubt, but a question he had not yet formed into words. He took a step in that direction, then stopped, unsure if the moment allowed it, unsure if he had earned the right to ask. Cruz noticed the hesitation, the shift in Blake's posture, and for the first time saw not just an officer, but a man recalibrating, adjusting to something that training had not prepared him for. Colonel Hayes turned slightly, his gaze following Ethan as he moved back toward the perimeter, and for a brief second their eyes met again. No words exchanged, none needed, because the decision had already been made, not just about the helicopter, but about the man who had quietly taken control of a situation without ever asking for it. "Ethan," Hayes said, not loudly, but enough to stop him, and the old man paused, turning just slightly, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, waiting, not expecting anything more than a simple acknowledgement. But what came next carried more weight than any formal recognition could have. Hayes held his gaze for a moment, measuring, confirming, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that did not belong in reports or ceremonies, but in the quiet language of trust between men who understood what had just happened. And in that moment, everyone on that tarmac felt it. The shift that could not be undone, the understanding that authority had recognized something greater than rank. And as the helicopter settled into a stable rhythm, ready for the next command, the silence that followed was no longer heavy with uncertainty, but filled with a quiet respect that had been earned without a single word asking for it. The helicopter held its rhythm steady now, the rotation smooth and controlled, each pass of the blades carving clean arcs through the air as if the machine had finally remembered what it was built to do. And around it the crew moved with a renewed precision, no longer chasing a problem but executing a solution. Lieutenant Blake stood still for a moment longer, watching the aircraft not as a challenge, but as a lesson unfolding in real time. And slowly he turned, his eyes finding Ethan again at the edge of the tarmac, the distance between them no longer defined by rank, but by understanding. Blake took a step forward, then another, the hesitation from before still present but thinner now, worn down by what he had witnessed. Specialist Cruz noticed and shifted slightly, giving space without making it obvious, because something was happening that did not need interruption. Ethan remained where he was, hands resting loosely at his sides, his attention drifting back to the helicopter only briefly before returning to the open horizon beyond the base, as if the moment had already passed for him, as if what mattered had already been done. Blake stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice. But for a second he did not, the words he had relied on before no longer fitting the situation in front of him. "You knew before anyone else," Blake said finally, not as an accusation, not even as a question, but as a recognition. And Ethan's expression did not change, his eyes calm, steady, reflecting nothing but the present. "I have seen it before," he replied, simple, direct, and that was all. No story, no explanation. Just a truth that carried more weight than anything Blake could have expected. The younger officer nodded slowly, absorbing it, understanding now that experience was not something you displayed. It was something you carried quietly until it was needed. Behind them, Colonel Hayes remained near the aircraft, his posture relaxed but attentive, watching both the machine and the men around it. And when he spoke, again, his voice carried easily across the space. "Prepare for lift check," he said. And the crew responded immediately, the command flowing without friction, because the uncertainty that had slowed them earlier was gone, replaced by clarity, by direction, by something that had not been written into any procedure, but had proven itself undeniable. The helicopter responded as expected, rising just inches off the ground before settling back, controlled, stable, exactly within parameters, a test passed not by numbers alone, but by the feel of it, by the way the machine held itself in the air. And as it touched back down, the final confirmation settled over the team. The issue was gone, resolved not through escalation or force, but through attention, patience, and the willingness to trust something beyond the obvious. Blake exhaled quietly, the last of his earlier resistance leaving him as he looked once more at Ethan, then back at the helicopter, the connection between the two now clear in a way it had not been before. And in that moment he understood that what he had witnessed was not just a fix, it was a standard, something he would measure himself against long after this day ended. Ethan turned slightly as if to leave, not seeking acknowledgement, not waiting for it, because for him the moment was already complete. But as he took that first step away, the sound of the rotor carried across the tarmac once more, steady, unwavering, a quiet reminder of what had just been set right. And though no one said it aloud, every person there knew that what they had seen would not be forgotten, not because of the machine, but because of the man who had understood it before anyone else even realized there was something to understand. The helicopter settled into a final steady idle, the rotation smooth, the sound no longer urgent but controlled, like a breath finally taken the right way, and the crew began to disperse without needing instruction, each person returning to their role with a quiet efficiency that carried a new weight, not just from the task completed, but from what had been understood in the process. Lieutenant Blake remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching as the last of the diagnostics confirmed what they already knew, that the system was now aligned with reality. And for the first time that day, he did not look at the screen for answers. He looked at the machine, and then beyond it, to the man who had already turned away. Ethan Cole moved at the same unhurried pace as before, hands at his sides, shoulders relaxed, as if the entire moment had never belonged to him in the first place, as if it had simply passed through him on its way to where it needed to go. Specialist crews watched him leave, something unsettled and inspired at the same time, trying to understand how someone could carry that kind of certainty without ever needing to show it. Colonel Hayes stepped away from the aircraft at last, his eyes following Ethan for a brief second before shifting back to his team, but the decision he had made still stood there, visible in the way he held himself, in the way the others now looked at him, not just as a commander, but as someone who had recognized something when it mattered most. "Lieutenant," Hayes said quietly, and Blake turned immediately, his posture straightening out of instinct, but his expression different now, less rigid, more aware. "Yes, sir," he replied, and Hayes studied him for a moment, not evaluating his performance, but something deeper, something that would carry forward beyond this one event. "What did you miss?" Hayes asked, not as a reprimand, but as a question that demanded honesty. Blake glanced once toward the helicopter, then back in the direction Ethan had gone, the answer forming slowly, not from memory, but from understanding. "I trusted what I was given," he said, "instead of what I was seeing." Hayes gave a small nod, not correcting him, not adding to it, because that answer was enough. It showed the shift had happened, not just on the tarmac, but in the way Blake would think moving forward, and that mattered more than any correction in the moment. The wind moved across the base again, lifting dust lightly along the concrete, carrying with it the fading echo of the rotor's rhythm. And for a brief second, everything felt still, balanced, complete in a way that did not need acknowledgement. Ethan reached the edge of the perimeter and paused, just for a moment, not turning back, not looking for anything, but simply standing there as if marking the end of something that had never been spoken. Then he continued on, disappearing